One thing we take for granted nowadays is just how easy it is to play most modern games portably. You have things like the Steam Deck, the Switch 2, that oddly named Xbox Asus thing, allowing you to play most AAA games natively. But also, mobile gaming has become so advanced that some big games have even been ported over to mobile phones, like Resident Evil 8, Hitman Absolution and Red Dead Redemption. Cloud gaming is also an option, letting you play most of your games almost anywhere with a stable internet connection. And yet people still complain when a game doesn't run at Ultra 4K 120fps on the Switch 2. Like, give it a break, it's a fucking Switch 2. You see, when I was growing up in the 2000s, there was none of this. If you wanted to play PS2 games portably, you better have had Exhibit on speed dial to hook up your car with some portable screen. And even that's only in one place, so you couldn't take it anywhere, so it's not really portable. If you wanted a true portable experience, we only had one option. The Game Boy Advance did really try to give you the same experience you had on consoles, but it just wasn't powerful enough. For example, this is Need for Speed Underground on the PS2, and this is Need for Speed Underground on the GBA. You see, it's not bad, but just nowhere near the same experience you had at home. Even with Nintendo's next console, the DS, it wasn't really trying to be a super powerful handheld device. It could only really handle similar games to what the N64 had, and even then it struggled. A few months before the DS release, Sony announced their plans to release a portable console at E3 2004. But this wouldn't just try to compete with what the DS had to offer though. Sony decided to make the most powerful handheld system we had ever seen. Not only would it be able to play console quality games, but it could also play movies, music and even browse the internet, which for a handheld device in 2005 was just insane. Today I wanted to take a look at some of the times when developers decided to really see what the PSP was capable of by looking at some of the PSP's best ports. And when I say ports, I mean the full console release being copied over to the PSP, not spin-off games like we saw for the God of War, GTA and Metal Gear Solid franchise. They're all their own original games in those respective franchises. I'm talking about the full game in its entirety and looking at the differences between them and its console release. Of course I'll be using the PS2 versions to compare to, as this makes the most sense. I'll also only be focusing on about 4 games as well, as I don't want this video to be too long, but if you know any other impressive PSP ports I should check out in a later video, let me know in the comments below. So without further ado, let's get started. The first game I have to talk about is the very first game I ever had for my PSP, and that is Smackdown VS Raw 2006. If you went back 20 years to Christmas 2005, you would have seen me spend almost the entire Christmas break playing this game. It's all I wanted that year, and it was the year I got into wrestling. I played wrestling games before, but mainly on the GameCube and Xbox, with titles like WrestleMania 18 and the dreaded WrestleMania 21. I missed out on the legendary Smackdown titles on the PlayStation 2 because for some weird reason back then each console had their very own unique WWE release as opposed to just releasing the same game on each platform. There was also portable WWE games as well on the Game Boy Advance which looked like this. There was also the Engage which had a wrestling game and it looked like this. So how was the PSP's WWE game? Well, it looked like this.
I came to crush anybody in my way. They getting hit with the chin music. Punk straight getting it.
This game was insane. I'm not joking when I say this. This is essentially the whole PS2 experience squeezed onto a little UMD disc. Everything is here, from all the arenas, all the wrestlers, all the game modes, but it also had additional minigames and an extra wrestler, exclusive to the PSP, with Jake the Snake Roberts. The only noticeable difference here is the graphics. I've never played both versions so close together, but from this gameplay it's so obvious which one's which. And yeah, the PS2 version is really clean and looks super smooth. But the PSP version compared to its portable competitors at the time looks like a goddamn PS5 in comparison. I think this is the best case scenario for any port to a less powerful system, knocking down the graphical fidelity to make sure the overall gameplay experience is not made worse in any way. I didn't really notice any difference in terms of performance, even with the 6-man matches in a Hell in a Cell. They felt pretty similar. I did notice however the crowd obviously being downgraded massively. Now by all means the PS2 crowds weren't amazing, but the PSP crowds are quite funny when you look at them. They're just 3 or 4 different sprites that have been copy and pasted, and when one of them does an animation, they all do the same thing. Another weird thing I noticed is just how much the ring ropes bounced when performing moves. Now this happened in the PS2 version, but on the PSP the ropes turned into fucking spaghetti, and it's just such a weird thing to change. I'm assuming something changed when they ported over the physics engine to the PSP, but it's still quite funny. Like I said, all game modes are here, and that includes SVR's story mode, season mode. I was really impressed with this as you get all the cutscenes and voice lines you get in the console version. They only made a few minor graphical changes, like gouging out Jonathan Coachman's eyes, but other than that, everything is here except you can't do this in the locker room, which you know is a massive shame. In fact, I don't even know why they bothered releasing the game. They should have just cancelled it without this massive feature. All the creation tools are of course here, being able to create wrestlers and championships among other things. I spent hours as a kid in these modes, but now this is the best I could come up with. Yep, I turned 30 this year. One more thing I need to mention, which is technically a downgrade, is the lack of commentary. I'm assuming to save space the developers just cut all the commentary out of the game and just use the game soundtrack in the background during matches, which I mean isn't really a bad thing at all. WWE games, especially in the 2000s, are notorious for having bad commentary.
I see where this one's going, JR. I don't think we're very far from the end of the match.
I disagree entirely, King. I'd bet my Oklahoma Sooner ass that this one isn't even close to being over.
That's a pretty big bet, JR. Are you sure you're able to cover it?
By the time the game released, it was getting better, but still after 4 matches, you'll just hear the same few lines being repeated over and over again, which you'll definitely get tired of. You know what you won't get tired of though? This game's soundtrack, because like most SVR games, the soundtrack is definitely a 10 out of 10, so it actually turned out to be a massive upgrade. Looking back, this port showed very early on what the PSP was capable of, bringing the whole experience to a portable device with little to no compromise. The thing a port should do first and foremost is make you feel like you're getting that exact experience you get with the original game. And it's safe to say Smackdown vs Raw 2006 ticks all the boxes. The PSP would end up getting ports of every single SVR game, but obviously after about 2008 the games were being made mainly for the much more powerful PS3 and 360, with these versions taking priority, but the PSP still had the modes from these versions being ported over with the same great experience and gameplay. The crazy thing is that people have been making mods for the PSP version of SVR 2011 ever since, with there being a 2K25 mod available to play, which is just insane, but also goes to show how well these games were ported over to the PSP, and Smackdown vs Raw 2006 is definitely up there as one of my all-time favourite wrestling games of all time. Now it's time to switch it up to one of the founding fathers of massive open world festival style races. I'm of course talking about Test Drive Unlimited. Now this is technically a port of a port, as there are 2 main versions of TDU, these being the PC and Xbox 360 version, which are the full definitive experience, and then the PS2 and PSP version, a much more watered down version but still fun nonetheless. The major difference being that the definitive versions focus a lot more on the lifestyle side of things, giving hitchhikers lifts like a really shitty version of Crazy Taxi, purchasing luxury apartments and clothing for your character, whereas the PS2 version was more just based around racing. The Sony versions were handled by a completely different studio, so it's almost like a completely different experience playing both games. The only other difference between the 2 versions is a few manufacturers are missing, but from here on out, I'll just be comparing the PS2 and PSP versions. So what is Test Drive Unlimited? Well, it's a very unique open world driving game. You see, at the time, most open world races were set in smaller cities with a larger emphasis on street racing and customization, whereas Test Drive didn't offer any form of customization, instead relying on its massive collection of cars and massive one-to-one recreation of the Hawaiian island Oahu, which compared to most open world games at the time was fucking massive. And you know what these crazy fuckers did? Crammed it all onto a PSP. Now of course the PSP does come with a few downgrades. The render distance is way shorter and the roads, buildings and cars don't have as much detail to them, but honestly after playing these 2 versions back to back I didn't really mind the downgrade on the PSP. I mean, comparing it to the PC version it's obvious, but compared to the PS2 version it isn't that bad. I did notice that the skybox on the PSP looked a bit duller, like they accidentally put the UK filter on, but maybe that was just while I was playing in this session. But other than that, I think the PSP version is still pretty impressive. I mean, come on, just look at that map, and the fact that there's like 100 cars to try out. You couldn't really go wrong with this back in the day. There's also an online mode, which is crazy to think, but also, look at what year it is. I'm not even going to attempt to play this online. A few other things missing from the PSP version are the lack of the cockpit camera, which, to be honest, I was surprised the PS2 version had this. That was extremely rare for that generation, so it's no surprise it's non-existent in the PSP version. Also, you can't see the avatar during menu screens, so you don't get to see this every time you enter the apartment. Gameplay wise, I didn't really notice the game running any worse or any drop in frames, but the physics did seem a little different, and after doing some research it turns out that it is an entirely different engine. The cars just seem a bit floatier, and God forbid you hit an NPC, you'll be sending them into 2027.
You have reached your destination.
The gameplay still feels great, and everything else is here. The weird amount of radio stations with the random, royalty-free sounding songs, the passive-aggressive police chases, and the map isn't just restricted to the road. You can just drive into the fields like I did here. Just don't look at the minimap. Yep, I'll turn 30 this year. Overall, Test Drive Unlimited is just an insane game to exist on the PSP. Heck, it's an insane game to exist on the PS2, With a map this big and a massive amount of cars to drive, there's hours of fun content here to play around with, and I'm kinda gutted I didn't really play it back in the day because this would have been the dream racing game on the go. The next game I need to talk about is a game I made a video about a few months ago, that being Tony Hawk's Underground 2, one of my all-time favourite games in the series.
Thank you, world, for tuning in.
The PSP version would actually be a launch title for the PSP in 2005. It's ironic because this is the earliest game to release I'm talking about today, and also might be the most similar to the original than any of the others. Like, I can't even tell the difference at a glance. Not only is it the most similar, it might even be the best version of the game as a whole. It offers new levels and skaters, among a few other things, without taking anything out from the base game. All the story modes, levels and cutscenes are here, most of the creator tools are here except for the one major one missing, which is Create a Park, and the new levels aren't just extra for you to skate around in, they're actually incorporated into the story, with their own unique cutscenes, guest characters and objectives. I'm not going to go into too much detail about Underground 2, because as I said, I've already made a video on the base game. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check that out. It's been over 6 months since I last played it, and I instantly got back into it. It's basically identical to the original, with a few minor tweaks. I think the sound effects might be a bit worse, but other than that and a few low-res textures, if you enjoyed the console version, there's no reason why you can't enjoy this. And maybe I'm just a bit rusty, but the controls do feel a bit jarring compared to the already finicky movement in the console version. As well, I feel like the game is a bit compromised due to the lack of a second analog stick and the lack of triggers. It seems like some controls have been changed to fit this and end up being more things for you to remember in an already input heavy game, but that is a minor criticism. It's still hard to believe that this was a launch title for the PSP. The developers at Shabba Games absolutely smashed it out of the park. It's the full experience plus a little more. There would only be one more port of a Tony Hawk game to the PSP, that being a little over a year later with Project 8. I've never really played this, but from what I've seen online, a lot of people seem to really like it, and it's a shame we only ever got 2 games from this great series on the handheld. I would have loved to have seen Underground 1 re-released, or even a Pro Skater collection of some kind, because it was obvious the PSP could handle it, but honestly, Underground 2 Remix is more than enough of a skating fix on Sony's handheld. Before I finish, I just wanted to talk about a few games I haven't had time to add in, these being Midnight Club 3 and Tekken Dark Resurrection. I've spoken about both games in previous videos, similar to Underground 2, but I felt like that game deserved a bit more attention than these two. Midnight Club 3 is essentially the same game as the console version. All the cars, all the races, customisation and 3 varied maps are all included, with just a few minor changes in terms of graphics, but it's the same great game. Then with Tekken, I already made a full video dedicated to that game a few years ago, so if you're a fan of that game or the Tekken series in general, go check that out, as I have a full retrospective series about Tekken. There's tons of great PSP ports out there I could have mentioned in this video, but I didn't want to make it too long, so if you'd like to see a part 2, let me know by commenting down below and subscribing. And also, is there any PSP ports that I need to look at that I might have missed today? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, it's time to talk about the last game. Well then, this is technically breaking a rule, as the next game is essentially a spin-off, but I had to talk about it because the original is one of my top 5 games of all time, that being Def Jam Fight for New York, and I'll be looking at the PSP release Def Jam Fight for New York, The Takeover.
Give me some room, I'm throwing elbows. Timberland boots, Air Force and shell toes. Who the fuck is this?
Now then, it is a spin-off, but is essentially the same game, just with a different story. I think the developers were trying to save space by cutting out all the cutscenes and most of the voice lines, and then just made a new story told through a comic book style. And it is actually a prequel to the first game in the series, Vendetta, which I thought was a pretty cool idea. I think this game is the most interesting out of all the games I've spoken about today, as it makes the most changes from the base game, whilst also keeping the same feel as the original. First and foremost, the soundtrack is still intact, which is probably the most important thing about this game, because it is just unreal. The story mode has changed, as I mentioned, but the core elements are still here. You still get to create a character, customise them with licensed clothing. Maybe I won't choose those jeans. Tattoos, jewellery, and upgrade their stats, moves and fighting styles. But the way you progress has changed a bit, and would be my main critique of the game. In the console version, you go to different stages and have a set amount of fighters to take out, giving you a sense of progression. But in the PSP version, you just keep going to each level, doing a fight or two with no real sense of direction. Just random fights around New York like some crackhead. You join one of 5 crews depending on which part of New York you choose to be from, and then, well, take over other boroughs, using fighters in your crew to defend different parts. The gameplay has changed quite a bit, and I don't know how to explain it, but the fighters seem lighter, everything seems a lot more fast paced, and yeah, overall it doesn't feel as in depth as the fighting mechanics on console. There's some new stages here as well, and they're kind of boring. One that's just in an alleyway, one on a rooftop and one on a barge. Nothing too special, and don't really add much to the game. Another thing that was cut was 4-player modes like Team Battle and Battle Royale, probably due to limitations, so you can only really have the traditional one-on-one matches here. This is the game I was probably most excited to revisit, but to be honest, it turns out it made way too many changes to be compared to the original. Nowadays, if you wanted to run it on an emulator, there's a chance you could run the console version just as well, so you're probably better off just going with the original instead. But that's not what this video is about. It's about PSP ports on a PSP, and I've got to say, I still kinda love it. It's close enough to the original that it feels like you're getting the same experience, and if you're away from home and all you had was a PSP and you wanted your Def Jam fix, I don't think this game would leave you disappointed at all. So why did I decide to take a look back at some random ports of mostly forgotten games on the PSP in 2026? Well, honestly, I think I kinda missed these unique versions of the same game releasing on different hardware, where developers had to be smart about what they took out and what they kept in, and also adding a few things on top. Nowadays, a port to something like the Switch 2 is just as simple as the developers putting the graphics on low and changing the frame rate. Every console now just feels exactly the same, and there's no real variety anymore when it comes to new versions of games. It's either do you want Assassin's Creed Shadows Reflection in Puddles Edition, or no Reflections in Puddles Edition. I miss the creativity of developers with things like PSP ports and even DS and GBA ports as well. They had to get creative to try and keep that same feeling you got on console, and as you've seen today, mostly succeed at that. There's so many more ports to talk about, for not only the PSP, but for many other consoles, which I definitely want to look at, so if you enjoyed this video and want to see me talk about more ports, let me know by liking and commenting down below. And also, please consider subscribing. I've already got so many videos planned for 2026, and I'm excited to get to work on them. But that's it from me today. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you when I see you.
I love the big screen, so fresh and so clean. It's all in my dreams. It makes me wanna scream. PSP, 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 PSP. Game so crazy, they totally amaze me. Gotta ask my mom for one. For shizzy.